people may accept obedience and deference and following orders, but not very far below the surface, they don't like it. And when people can express themselves, you see it, as, say, in the labor press in this area in the mid-19th century, which are pretty radical, though they never heard about any radical movements. So you have to block democracy. That's a real threat. And if you can, there's many ways of trying to, it's the same domestically. I mean, it's a long story, but in the United States, for example, it's a very free country by comparative standards. Roughly 70% of the population has no influence on policy at all. It's been well studied even in professional political science. Influence increases until at the very top you have people essentially get what they want. That has nothing to do with democracy. If you look at popular attitudes in the United States, they're actually mostly social democratic. Even on the right, like the Tea Party, people want more spending on education, on health care, and so on. These things have to be stopped. You can't allow that. Right now, it's very striking. All the talk in the United States in the political class, the government, the media, and so on, is about the deficit. You take a look at popular opinion. The public thinks the deficit is not a major problem. The major problem is jobs. To get jobs, you have to stimulate the economy. And interestingly, the business press agrees with them. Bloomberg Business Week, for example, says the same thing. But that's not what the financial institutions want. That's not what the wealthy want. So therefore, it doesn't enter into political discussion. Well, that's a kind of democracy. People aren't sent to the gulag and so on, but it's a very constrained democracy. It's a business-run, flawed democracy, and just as in Egypt or Brazil or anywhere else, elites certainly don't want functioning democracy. Functioning democracy would mean, for example, that stakeholders, workforce and community take over enterprises and run them themselves. They call it impossible. We say it's possible. So we're demanding the impossible. Be realistic, demand the impossible means we're going to make it real. And so yes, impossible is their term, but reality is what we want to construct. It keeps reviving because I think it's just below the surface, actually. So it keeps reviving all the time. Revived in the 1960s again, in many different ways. And every time it revives, you get these anarchist strains coming out. By now, around some of the working-class areas in Ohio, around Cleveland, there's a network and a growth of worker-owned enterprises, some of them fairly substantial. The U.S. Steel, the union, has just made an arrangement with Mondragon in Spain, huge conglomerate, which is worker-owned, not worker-managed, and is pretty successful. And where it'll go, I don't know, but there's at least tentative efforts in this direction to try to reconstruct what has been a force in American history from the beginning. We want to run our own lives. We don't want bosses. We don't want to be degraded. We don't want to live in a world of deference and obedience. And we want to run enterprises ourselves. We don't need you. Why have bosses? That keeps coming out. That's one of the reasons why the business world was so terrified in the 1930s, as you can see from business publications, when the sit-down strikes began. That was really threatening. I mean, a sit-down strike, the workers don't march outside. They sit in the factory. And it's not going to take long before they decide, why don't we just run this factory? Who needs those guys? We have the skills. We can do it all ourselves. So throw out the bankers and the managers sitting off in some New York suite, and we'll run the place. and that's frightening. Things like that are happening all the time. They've started up again in the current financial crisis, and you can't. Is this anarchist? You can't really say. It's got some of the same strains, and we do have to remember that a large part of the anarchist movement was not just saying no; it was saying yes to a different kind of society which we'll organize and run. And there are efforts now to develop, fairly elaborate conceptual frameworks, theories, if you like, about how this might work, like participatory economics, Albert and Hanel and Shalom and a lot of others, big groups all over the world, in fact, here too. Whether all of this can come together in some form, it's pretty hard to say, but it might. Let's keep to the United States. A couple of years ago, as part of this financial crash, the auto companies crashed, and the government took over a substantial part of the auto industry. They were kind of quasi-nationalized under Obama. There were a couple of paths that could have been taken. One was the path that actually was taken, reconstruct the industry so that it's more profitable and, lower wages and two-tiered work systems in which new workers don't get benefits and so on, and then hand it back to the banks and the management class, and they can go on producing automobiles and so on. That was these are also, incidentally, big financial institutions, the General Motors and so on. So reconstruct them into something like what they were, but more efficient. That was the course that was taken. There was another possible course, which was talked about and a little bit of organizing about, but not enough to have a big impact. That was hand the whole industry over to its workforce and to the communities, so-called stakeholders. Let them have it, and let them produce things that the country really needs. The future, I think it depends on whether the things that develop, what we say spontaneously, but nothing really develops spontaneously. There's always a background of thinking, organization, struggle, and so on. But when something bursts out, like, say, the Spanish Revolution or Occupy or the Indignados or Latin American breaking of neoliberal bonds or Tahrir Square or enterprise, worker-owned enterprises in Cleveland, all over the place. When anything breaks out, it typically has an anarchist flair to it. And it's also just in personal life, breaking down of bonds of patriarchy, let's say. Those are anarchist positions way back, not only anarchist. If you look around the world, I don't think we have to waste time on the fact that we have a major environmental crisis. It's huge, and it may be imminent. And if you look around the world, the groups that are in the forefront of trying to do something serious about it are indigenous communities. They may call themselves Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, whatever they call themselves. These are the ones who are pressing the hardest to pay attention to what they even call the rights of nature, which is an old anarchist idea, incidentally, though I never heard of it. Rights of nature have to be protected. I mean, in countries with a large indigenous population, like Bolivia and Ecuador, it's actually in the laws now. You have to respect the rights of nature. These are people who are struggling against mining all over the world. Big battles all over the world, India, Australia, Colombia, against mining operations which are just destroying nature and destroying our lives at the same time. And that's kind of ecological anarchism from a different point of view. And that's a kind of sensibility that the industrial world is going to have to internalize, or we're going to be really facing doom seriously.
In a speech reproduced over 20 years ago in the film version of Manufacturing Consent, you describe hegemonic capitalist ideology as reducing the life world of Earth to an infinite resource and an infinite garbage can. Even then, you had identified the capitalist tendency toward total destruction. You speak of a looming cancellation of destiny for humanity if the madness of capitalism is not halted within this, the possibly terminal phase of human existence. The very title and argumentation of hegemony or survival continue in this light. How do you think a resurgent international anarchist movement might respond positively to such alarming trends?
Well, I think an emergent in my view, anarchism is just the most advanced form of political thought. As I say, it draws from the Enlightenment, its best ideals, the primary contributions of classical liberalism, carries it forward. Paracon, which you mentioned, is one illustration. They don't call themselves anarchists, but and there are others like it. So I think that a resurgent anarchist movement, which would be the peak of human intellectual civilization, should join with the indigenous societies of the world to take, so that they don't have the burden of trying to save humanity from its own craziness. This should take place within the richest, most powerful societies. I mean, it's kind of like a moral truism that the more privilege you have, the more responsibility you have. It's elementary in every domain. You have privilege, you have opportunities, you have choices, you have responsibilities. In the rich, powerful societies, privileged people like us, we're all privileged people, we have the responsibility to take the lead in trying to prevent the disasters that our own social institutions are creating. It's outrageous to demand or even observe the poorest, most repressed people in the world taking the lead in trying to save the human species and, in fact, innumerable other species from destruction. Mm-hmm. So we should join them. That's the role of an anarchist movement. This is the first time in 500 years, since the Spanish and Portuguese explorers came. It's the first time that Latin America has begun to take its fate into its own hands. I mean, traditionally, Latin America had sort of two core problems. One problem was that the states that were established by the conquest were separated from one another. There's very little integration among them. Each state was, there weren't even roads between them. They were quite separated. They were oriented towards the imperial power. Furthermore, there was an internal disintegration. The typical Latin American state has a sector of extreme wealth and privilege, which is sort of European in character, later U.S. in character. They send their children to study abroad. They have the second home on the Riviera. They invest in Zurich. That sort of thing. They're really basic, and they're in fact white often, or more white. That makes a difference. So you have an essentially white, Europeanized elite running the country. A huge mass of misery, oppression, some of the worst in the world, and they're all separated from one another. Well, they've begun to overcome that. They're now South American institutions in which they're organized. They're addressing, to some extent, the internal problems. Latin America, say, as distinct from East Asia, Latin America, Latin America has has much better basis for development than East Asia did. It has resources, no enemies, external enemies, everything. But imports to Latin America were luxury goods. Imports to East Asia were capital goods. The East Asian tigers, as they're called, controlled technology, directed investment, and so on. Latin America was just in the hands of foreign investors and domestic elites. They didn't pay any attention to development. All of that is changing. Striking difference is indigenous rights, which you mentioned. There's a huge indigenous population in Latin America. In North America, they were mostly exterminated, but in Latin America, they survived. Not entirely, but substantially. And some countries, like, say, Bolivia, is majority indigenous. Well, they've begun, not for the first time, but for the first time successfully, they've succeeded in taking things over for themselves. In Bolivia, Bolivia is a kind of a model of democracy. It's a country, the elections of the 2000s, the last 10 years, have been won by political organizations which are largely indigenous. And the president is somebody who comes out of their own ranks. Not some rich guy, but poor peasant, Evo Morales. And the elections they're not circuses like in the United States. They're on serious issues, resource control, cultural rights, which are quite complex in these kind of multicultural societies, women's rights, and so on. Major big issues that people are engaged in, and they've achieved a lot. By now, in fact, one achievement is that the U.S. has been thrown out of every one of its military bases in South America. None left, There was a new organization formed about a year ago, so it hasn't done much, but it may. It's an organization of the Western Hemisphere states, excluding the United States and Canada. That's pretty important. That means, we're not going to be playthings in the hands of the rich white Northerners. Those are major achievements. There's plenty of things wrong, but quite significant achievements.
We have a question coming from Twitter, and it's been coming from a lot of people, so the people that have given it to me. And I think it's an important question. Now, as you know, Canada's economy is more and more sitting on going towards natural resources. It's a natural resource-based economy we're developing with the oil sands. And the people that are in the front line in this are the First Nations, and they are starting to resist actively, and we've seen this mostly in the past year and a half. So how do you evaluate the impact of this mobilization on Canadian politics and on Canadian society?
How it impacts Canadian politics and society, it's for you to judge. But I think we should describe it a little more, slightly different terms. It's true that Canadian policy is more and more oriented towards natural resource extraction in Canada and throughout the world. Canadian mining operations are just destroying large parts of the world. Canada's not alone, but it's one of the leaders. And the accurate term for this is that Canada is trying to take the lead in destroying the possibility of decent survival. That's what it means to exploit tar sands and do gold mining in Colombia and coal mining and so on and so forth. That means try to destroy the world in which your grandchildren might be able to survive. That's the Canadian idea now, not what John Holmes said. And Canada's got a leading role in this. There is resistance. In Canada, it's coming from First Nations. But it's worth remembering that that's a worldwide phenomenon. Throughout the world, the indigenous populations are in the lead in trying to arrest indigenous, what do we call them, or they call themselves, are actually taking the lead in trying to protect the earth. That's extremely significant. This is something that goes back hundreds of years. Actually, it goes back to the core of Anglo-American Canadian law 800 years ago, Magna Carta. In 2 years, there'll be the 800th anniversary. It'll be interesting to see how it's commemorated. Magna Carta had two parts. The one part people sort of know about, what's called the Charter of Liberties. It was, presumption of innocence, the right to jury trial, and so on. It was kind of limited in the 13th century. It's been expanded over the years. And by now it's been almost eviscerated in the last 10 years in all kind of ways. So that's a disaster. But there was another part to the Magna Carta. It was called the Charter of the Forests. And that had to do with protecting the commons from the king, protecting the commons from the depredations of authority. What are the commons? The commons are the forests, the woodlands, the fields, the things that people own in common. And it was the source of their food, their fuel, it was a welfare system. The Robin Hood myths are based on this, protecting the commons, in that case from the sheriff, from authority. And it was amazing. The commons were cultivated, protected, and sustained over the centuries and developed. So they were well developed by people who wanted them for the future, for themselves and for their future generations. And the idea was to save it from attack by authority. Well, you look through the centuries, it's been chipped away. With the rise of capitalism in England, the enclosure movements and others, capitalist corporate and state power, wasn't corporate then, business and state power, landowner power, chipped away at the commons and opened them up for private exploitation. It continues to the present. What Canada and the US and others are doing now is trying to take away what's left of the commons, includes the global environment, privatize it, take it away. Now there is a myth that we're all taught called the tragedy of the commons. It's a modern conception. The myth is that if you leave something under common control and supervision, it's going to be destroyed. The only way to save anything is to put it under private ownership. Okay, you open your eyes and you see it's the opposite. When it's under private ownership, it's going to be destroyed for profit making. If it belongs to the commons, to the people, the commons in general, they're all protected. Plenty of experience with that. And when First Nations or indigenous populations in Bolivia or the Aboriginals in Australia, Adivasi in India, all over the world, when they're trying to protect a remnant of the commons from private power, predatory private power, it's a struggle that goes back 800 years. It's now reaching the point where the survival of, literally survival, depends on it. So going back to the question, what impact will this have in Canada? That's really for you to decide. It's not a matter for prediction, but for action.
Our minuscule brain cannot perceive what is the might and sophistication of nature. Yet, without me needing to understand everything, the world exists. The land is not real estate. You own real estate. That there is land and nature, and nobody owns that. This idea of time, my brain can stretch back 30 years. The land's millions. And I get to be connected to that.
Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, humans have viewed nature as a resource from which to extract commodities: fish, energy, minerals, timber. Nature is also seen as a place to dispose of waste, often without considering the impacts it may have on the human condition, whose lives depend on a healthy ecosystem. Today, these environmental challenges continue, but a new idea, pulled from ancient indigenous practice, may provide the earth with a rights-based solution.
You are the child, and that land out there, that earth mother of yours, is your parent. No human owns your mother.